The chamber was still, the kind of silence that doesn't breathe, doesn't blink, doesn't even dare to shift in its seat. Judge Emmet Sullivan leaned forward, eyes narrowing with the weight of decades on the bench, his voice cutting like steel through the air. "Where's your proof, Miss Crockett?" His tone was not hostile, but firm, demanding. The voice of authority that had broken weaker advocates in moments like this. Every camera swung toward Jasmine Crockett. Every critic expected her to flinch. They wanted hesitation, a stumble, a flicker of doubt that could be clipped and replayed endlessly across news cycles. Instead, Jasmine stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the evidence folder she had carried in like it was both weapon and shield. For a breathless second, she said nothing. The pause alone rattled the room. It felt deliberate, like she was allowing the tension to swell, daring even the walls to lean closer. Then, the controlled calm that disguised the storm beneath her chest, she lifted a single sheet of paper. No grand flourish, no theatrics. Just one page held in her steady hand, the ink on it heavier than the weight of the marble pillars around them. "Your Honor," she began, her voice low but unwavering, "you asked for proof. Here it is." The murmurs started instantly, hissing through the room like a rising wind. Some scoffed, expecting another political stunt. Others craned forward, sensing something different, something dangerous. Judge Sullivan reached out, the faintest hesitation in his motion betraying his curiosity. He took the paper, adjusted his glasses, and read. The moment his eyes touched the words, the shift was visible. His jaw stilled, the rhythm of his breath caught. His eyes froze halfway through the page. For the first time in years, a man renowned for keeping composure in the fiercest storms of American justice faltered. The cameras caught it all. The flicker of disbelief, the tightening of his grip, the unmistakable pause of a judge who had just confronted something undeniable. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply stood, shoulders squared, gaze steady. The embodiment of truth, embodied in human form. Because what she revealed next was so undeniable. Judge Emmet Sullivan himself froze. But this wasn't just about one piece of paper. It was about the soul of justice in America. The setting was more than a courtroom. It was an arena, a stage upon which the nation itself seemed to lean forward, waiting to see who would flinch. Every chandelier shimmered with a sterile glow, casting long shadows across the polished benches where journalists, aides, and political rivals sat shoulder to shoulder. The cameras weren't just recording, they were judging. The microphones weren't simply amplifying. They were weaponizing every syllable, ready to echo words across millions of screens before the ink of the transcripts had dried. For Jasmine Crockett, the pressure was more than procedural, it was personal. She knew what was at stake was not just her credibility, but the dignity of countless Americans who saw themselves in her immigrants. Workers, marginalized voices, often dismissed by power. Her words carried the weight of those who had been silenced, those who had been told evidence didn't matter when it threatened the powerful. Judge Sullivan's chambers had always been a place of gravity, but today the air felt electric. One side sat her critics, lips curled into satisfied smirks, waiting for her to stumble. They had rehearsed their headlines. Crockett collapses under pressure. No proof, just rhetoric. They were already crafting their victory tweets, savoring the downfall of a woman they considered too bold, too defiant, too unafraid to stand where others stayed silent. On the other side were supporters quiet, cautious, hearts pounding not just for Jasmine, but for the possibility that truth could actually break through. These were people who had lived their lives watching arrogance triumph, watching corruption excuse itself with a wink and a handshake. Today they were watching for something different, something that would prove their faith in democracy wasn't naive, and hovering above all of it was the press. Reporters scribbled notes with pens trembling in anticipation, knowing that one moment could tilt the narrative of the week, perhaps the year. Networks had already prepared their lower thirds. Showdown in Sullivan's courtroom. Producers were whispering in anchors' ears, Get ready, this could be big. The entire ecosystem of media hungered for drama, and Jasmine Crockett's every breath fed their appetite. But what made this moment monumental wasn't the politics of the day, it was the symbolism. This wasn't just testimony, it was America. Staring at itself in the mirror? Would truth be valued, or would power once again bury it? Would integrity shine, or would arrogance sneer it back into silence? Jasmine could feel the weight pressing in from all sides. Each second stretched long, each heartbeat pounding louder. She could almost hear the voices of those who doubted her, mocking in unison. She won't last. She doesn't belong here. Just fold like the rest. And yet, beneath the swirl of tension, there was a different rhythm, a steadier one. It was the rhythm of her resolve, forged in years of being underestimated, of fighting battles no headline ever bothered to record. As Judge Sullivan's eyes lingered on her evidence, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded. Every rival thought they saw the opening to pounce. Every ally feared she had reached too far. The nation, watching from classrooms, kitchens, and crowded living rooms, wondered if this was just another show trial where truth was drowned out by spectacle. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't rattled. She wasn't folding. She inhaled, slow and deliberate, and raised her chin. The critics thought the weight of the moment would crush her. Instead, it sharpened her focus, transforming her presence from defendant of truth to champion of it. And just when critics thought she'd crumble under pressure, Crockett sharpened her focus. To understand the gravity of what unfolded in Judge Sullivan's chamber, you have to understand the forces aligned against Jasmine Crockett. They weren't simply critics voicing disagreement. They were a network of power brokers, pundits, and political operatives who had invested everything in her downfall. Their strategy was simple: discredit her, distort her, and drown her in doubt before she ever had the chance to speak her truth. For months leading up to this moment, these antagonists had painted Crockett as reckless, unprepared, and out of her depth. They mocked her passion as emotional outbursts. They dismissed her research as partisan spin. They carried themselves with a smugness that wasn't born of righteousness, but of confidence in the machinery of influence they controlled. Their arrogance dripped through every interview, every press release, every carefully placed smear in sympathetic media outlets. One of their favorite tactics was contradiction. When Crockett spoke with urgency, they said she was hysterical. When she presented evidence calmly, they said she was cold and detached. If she fought fiercely, they labeled her aggressive. If she held back, they accused her of weakness. In their world, she could never be enough, because her very presence threatened the old order they clung to. They prided themselves on polished lies, statements delivered with rehearsed poise and the veneer of credibility. A senator here, a lobbyist. There, a pundit spinning in prime time, they all worked in sync, creating an echo chamber where falsehood sounded louder than fact. They believed that if they repeated the same lines enough times, Crockett has no proof. Crockett is all theater. Crockett is chasing shadows. Then eventually the public would believe it. But what they underestimated was the resilience of raw truth. Where their speeches were manicured and practiced, Crockett's words came unfiltered from the core of lived experience. She wasn't speaking from the safety of privilege or from the comfort of a protected class. She was speaking as someone who had fought her way through the corridors of power, carrying the scars of every dismissal and insult. And that authenticity, though derided by her enemies, was the very quality that resonated with the people beyond those courtroom walls. Still, in the run-up to the hearing, the antagonists radiated confidence. They paraded across cable news declaring that Crockett would embarrass herself in front of Sullivan. They whispered in Washington hallways that her evidence was thin, her arguments shallow. Some even predicted that the judge would scold her publicly in a way that would end her credibility for good. Their smug laughter spilled into editorials, their overconfidence seeping into social media memes mocking her determination. Behind the facade of power, however, was fear. They knew that if Crockett managed to break through, if she managed to place undeniable truth in front of the country, Their entire narrative would collapse. Years of spin, months of plotting, hours of rehearsed talking points would crumble in a heartbeat. But arrogance often blinds its host, and instead of preparing for that possibility, they convinced themselves it could never happen. That was their greatest contradiction: to call her unworthy while fearing her potential, to brand her irrelevant. While centering entire strategies on her destruction, they wanted the public to see her as powerless, but in truth, their obsession revealed how powerful she already was. On the morning of the hearing, their confidence radiated through the marble halls. Could see it in the way they adjusted their ties, the way they leaned back in leather chairs, spring to each other as if the outcome was already sealed. They thought Jasmine Crockett was about to be humiliated. They thought Judge Sullivan would press her, and she would crack. They thought their victory would be swift and definitive, broadcast in real time for the nation to consume. But arrogance is a fragile crown, and as Sullivan read the page she had placed in front of him, that crown began to slip. Every polished lie, every contradiction, every smug prediction hung in the balance, waiting to be shattered by the force of what was now undeniable. The antagonists didn't know it yet, but their downfall had already begun. What they believed was just another routine performance by a politician they underestimated was, in fact, the opening act of their undoing. Their smug confidence was about to be shattered, long before. Jasmine Crockett stood in Judge Sullivan's chamber with the weight of a nation pressing down on her shoulders. She had lived a life that taught her how to withstand storms. She was not born into privilege, not raised with the certainty of power waiting to embrace her. Her story began in the grit of working-class struggle, in communities where survival demanded both resilience and vision. Her earliest memories weren't of ease, but of effort, watching her parents stretch paychecks, watching neighbors help one another when institutions failed them. She grew up understanding that dignity wasn't granted. It was carved out of persistence, one act of endurance at a time. And in every classroom, every workplace, every political arena she would later step into, the echoes of those beginnings stayed with her, grounding her, guiding her. From her first days in public service, Crockett was underestimated. She remembers walking into rooms where she was the youngest, the only woman of color, and immediately being treated as if her voice carried less weight. Colleagues mistook her fire for inexperience, her assertiveness for arrogance, that she didn't belong, that she was punching above her weight. But each dismissal, each sneer, only steeled her resolve. She carried the memories of those who had been silenced for generations. And she knew that when she spoke, she carried more than her own story. Well, she carried theirs. Law became her weapon of choice, not because it promised glory, but because it offered a shield for the powerless. She cut her teeth defending the voiceless, standing beside those who couldn't afford polished attorneys or the luxury of well-connected allies. In those cramped courtrooms, with flickering lights and overworked judges, she learned the true value of evidence. For people like her clients, facts weren't abstract. They were survival. Without proof, justice was denied. With proof, the truth could claw its way through even the most stubborn barriers. That lesson etched itself deep into her, long before her name ever appeared in national headlines. And yet, her rise was not meteoric. It was grueling. Every step upward felt like walking against the wind of entrenched power. Lobbyists dismissed her, party elites rolled their eyes, and opponents tried to trap her with the double standard reserved for women who dared to show strength. But Crockett's fire was not built for applause. It was forged in resistance. She didn't need their approval. She needed only the clarity of her own mission to prove that truth, spoken with courage, could bend even the most rigid systems. The moments of being underestimated became her secret reservoir of strength. She recalled the early debates where opponents laughed when she cited case law until her precision dismantled their arguments. She remembered the headlines calling her too combative until those same critics had to admit she was right. Time and again, she turned underestimation into her greatest advantage, catching arrogance off guard with the force of preparation and conviction. By the time she entered the national stage, Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to the burden of expectation. She knew the eyes of young women, immigrants, and marginalized communities followed her, searching for proof that someone like them could stand toe-to-toe with power and not shrink. She didn't ask for that role, but she embraced it with the quiet knowledge that symbols matter. To stand firm was to tell a generation that dignity does not bow. Her fire was not rage for its own sake. It was love for the truth, love for the people who trusted her, love for the ideals of justice that America so often preached but rarely practiced. That love fueled her persistence when exhaustion whispered otherwise. It steadied her hands when intimidation tried to shake her. It gave her courage to walk into hearings where allies warned her she was being set up to fail. And so, when she placed that single sheet of evidence before Judge Sullivan, it wasn't just the act of a lawyer or politician. It was the culmination of a lifetime of fighting to be heard in a world that preferred her silent. It was the embodiment of every struggle, every dismissal, every late night spent poring over records that others had ignored. For Jasmine Crockett, this moment was not abstract policy or partisan spectacle. It was the vindication of every sacrifice that had carried her here. It was a chance to prove once again that truth has a power no smear campaign can fully contain. As the world watched her stand steady, under the weight of scrutiny, those who truly knew her weren't surprised. They had seen this resilience before, in smaller rooms with smaller stakes, where she fought with the same intensity, even when no cameras were rolling. The difference now was that the entire nation could finally see it too, and as the tension in the courtroom grew, as rivals whispered eagerly and allies held their breath, Jasmine Crockett knew what they didn't. This wasn't just another hearing for her, it was personal. Judge Sullivan set the paper back on the desk, his face unreadable. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, broken only by the shuffle of reporters' pens and the faint hum of cameras' worry in the back. Then, in a voice low and deliberate, he began. "Ms. Crockett, what you have presented is significant. But significance does not always equal proof. Tell me, how does this document directly tie to the allegations before us today?" The question struck like a hammer sharp, deliberate and designed to test her foundation. For most, it would have rattled confidence. But Jasmine's expression didn't waver. She drew in a slow breath, then answered with precision, layering her words like bricks in a wall no opponent could easily climb. She explained the connections step by step, citing dates, names, and trails that had been ignored until now. Each fact was a nail driven firmly into place. But as she spoke, the antagonists pounced. One of them, a polished figure in a navy suit, leaned forward with a theatrical scoff. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's stringing together half-truths and coincidences. This is nothing more than a political stunt." His words echoed with false indignation, clearly rehearsed for the cameras rather than the court. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, urging order, but the interruptions kept coming. Another opponent chimed in, voice dripping with condescension. "She's speculating. None of this so-called evidence can hold up under scrutiny." Their strategy was clear. Flood the room with noise, drown her clarity in a storm of theatrics, and hope the spectacle overshadowed the truth. But Crockett refused to be shaken. She did not raise her voice, did not match their bluster. Instead, she stood taller, her tone measured, her words sharper than any insult hurled at her. Each time they interrupted, she waited, allowing their arrogance to fill the space before, calmly reclaiming it with fact. Her composure only magnified the contrast or steadiness against their desperation. The tension thickened. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, caught between outrage at the antagonist's disrespect and awe at Crockett's unflinching resolve. Even the reporters, trained to hide reaction, exchanged quick glances as the air in the room turned electric. It was as though the very walls of the chamber were bracing for impact. Judge Sullivan pressed again, this time with more edge in his voice. "Ms. Crockett, if your evidence is as strong as you claim, why has it not been brought forward sooner? Why now?" It was the kind of question that could unravel a weaker witness, implying delay equaled doubt. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This was the moment her critics had been waiting for, the stumble, the hesitation, the collapse. But Crockett didn't stumble. She leaned into the question, her gaze locked firmly on Sullivan's. "Because Your Honor. Those who should have brought it forward didn't want it seen. It's because sometimes truth doesn't arrive on schedule. It arrives when someone refuses to stop searching for it. Her voice carried not just the answer to his question, but the weight of every obstacle she had overcome to stand in this room. The antagonists tried again to drown her out, their voices rising in overlapping protests. Baseless speculation, irrelevant, but their desperation betrayed them. Each outburst only made Crockett's composure more striking, her patience more powerful. The audience could feel it, the scales of credibility beginning to tilt. Judge Sullivan, still pressing, turned the final screw. Then show us. Not words, not insinuations. Show us the undeniable connection. His tone was cutting final, leaving no room for escape. The demand hung in the air like thunder. Before a storm, Crockett's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with certainty. She had been waiting for this moment. Every hour of preparation, every late night poring over evidence, every dismissal and insult had led her here. The trap was set, the timing perfect. The room seemed to hold its breath. The antagonists smirked, convinced she had reached the end of her rope. Supporters clenched their fists, praying she would not falter. Even Judge Sullivan leaned closer, expecting either a collapse or a revelation. And then Crockett shifted her papers, drew one page forward, and prepared to deliver the blow that no one saw coming. But nobody expected what happened when Crockett finally snapped the trap shut. The shuffle of papers seemed to echo louder than footsteps in a cathedral. Jasmine Crockett's hand rested firmly on the single page she had drawn forward, her fingertips pressing against it as if she knew the very weight of justice itself lived within its margins. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence build, let the antagonists fidget in their seats, let the cameras zoom closer, desperate to capture the moment history might pivot. Finally, she looked up at Judge Sullivan, her voice steady, but edged with gravity. Your Honor, the document before you is not speculation. It is not interpretation. It is the direct acknowledgement of those who swore there was nothing to hide. This is their own signature, their own words, their own contradictions staring us in the face. She lifted the page high enough for the cameras to catch it. A hush swept through the chamber. Porters strained to catch every detail, pens frozen above notepads. Even Sullivan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to absorb the text from across the room. Jasmine placed the document on the evidence stand. This memorandum was circulated internally months ago. Shows that not only were they aware of the discrepancies, but they actively strategized how to bury them. And the date? Your Honor, the date on this memorandum aligns perfectly with the moment they told this court, under oath, that no such evidence existed. A gasp rippled across the gallery. One of her loudest critics, sitting just 2 rows behind, shifted uncomfortably, his smirk dissolving into a grimace. Another antagonist shot up from his chair, voice quivering with forced outrage. Objection. This is nothing more than selective reading, a distortion meant to mislead. Crockett turned toward him, her expression unflinching. Selective reading? Then perhaps you'd like to explain why your own client's initials sit right here, proving the very language that denies what they swore in this chamber never occurred. She pointed directly to the damning line. Her words landed with the precision of a blade. The man stammered, his voice faltering. That's not. It doesn't mean what she's implying. Standard bureaucratic phrasing. His hands gestured wildly, desperate to conjure credibility from thin air. But the audience wasn't convinced. The murmurs grew louder, disbelief spreading like wildfire through the room. Judge Sullivan raised his gavel slightly but didn't strike it. His eyes never left the page. His once firm skepticism softened, then shifted first to curiosity, then to something far rarer, shock. He read the lines again, slower this time, as though unable to believe he had overlooked something so plain. His jaw tightened, and the silence from the bench spoke louder than any ruling. Jasmine didn't rush. She let Sullivan's reaction do the work. When she finally spoke again, her words were slow, deliberate, every syllable carved with purpose. For months, I have been told there was nothing here, that I was chasing shadows. that I was embarrassing myself with theories and questions no one wanted answered. But this, she tapped the page, is not theory. This is fact, signed and sealed by the very people who ridiculed the truth. The antagonist scrambled. Another one stood, his voice booming with artificial certainty. Your Honor, this is an incomplete document. Without full context, it means nothing. She's weaving a story where none exists. Jasmine turned toward him, her eyes steady, her voice calm. Context? Very well. Let me provide it. She reached into her folder and drew out a second page. The air in the room thickened. This is the email chain that accompanied the memorandum. Confirms, in plain words, the intention to suppress this information before it reached this courtroom. She read aloud a line so damning that the audience gasped in unison. If this surfaces, it will be catastrophic. Ensure it is withheld. The chamber erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Phones buzzed as aides texted. Their networks and the antagonists' faces drained of color. One tried to protest, but the words caught in his throat, stuttered syllable collapsing into silence. Judge Sullivan set his glasses down and leaned back, his hand covering his mouth. His eyes lingered on Crockett, not dismissive, not doubtful, but studying, as if reassessing everything he thought he knew about her. The silence from the bench was deafening. It was the silence of a man who had just seen the undeniable, and Jasmine was not done. She reached for a small recorder, its light blinking red. And because documents can be dismissed as misunderstandings, Your Honor, I have this. She pressed play. The chamber filled with the recorded voice of one of the very antagonists, who had mocked her. The voice was unmistakable, the tone casual, almost careless. We'll bury it. By the time she finds it, no one will care. The sound waves hung in the air like a confession carved into stone. The antagonists erupted, shouting over one another, their denials frantic, their faces pale with panic, taken out of context. Illegally obtained? This is outrageous. But their voices no longer carried weight. Every shout sounded like desperation, every excuse like another nail sealing their credibility's coffin. The audience had shifted entirely. No longer skeptical, they leaned forward with wide eyes, jaws slack. The journalists who had been preparing stories of her collapse now scribbled new headlines in real time. Crockett drops bombshell. Judge stunned into silence. Proof. At last, and through it all, Jasmine Crockett stood calm, her fire contained but unyielding. Her voice cut through the chaos like a steady beacon. This is not about politics. This is about truth. And truth, as you can see, doesn't stutter. It doesn't hide. It doesn't need theatrics to survive. She let her gaze sweep across. Her opponents, their arrogance crumbling under the weight of her evidence. Judge Sullivan finally lowered his hand from his mouth. His expression, once skeptical, now held something else entirely: respect. Not the polite acknowledgement given to an advocate who had done her homework, but the quiet deference of a man confronted by truth too heavy to deny. He didn't say it out loud, but the stillness in his body, the intensity in his stare, told the entire room he had been moved. Jasmine placed the final sheet of paper back on the stand, then stepped back. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to deliver a triumphant smirk. Her evidence had spoken for itself, louder than any victory speech ever could. The antagonists sat in stunned silence. Their earlier confidence dissolved into fragments. Their polished lies lay shattered across the chamber floor, and no theatrics could piece them back together. Jasmine Crockett had done more than present proof. She had exposed arrogance, stripped bare hypocrisy, and forced the most powerful figures in the room to confront their own deceit. Her words and evidence didn't just land, they detonated. The room was frozen, the nation was watching, and for a moment, even time seemed to hold its breath, and the ripple effect didn't stop in that courtroom. The courtroom may have fallen into silence, but outside those walls, the sound was deafening. Within minutes of Crockett's evidence hitting the record, the story ignited across every screen in America. Hashtags blazed to the top of trending lists. Hashtag Crockett exposed the truth. Hashtag frozen judge. Hashtag justice unveiled. Clips of her calm delivery, the damning document, a day and the antagonist's stuttering denials looped endlessly on feeds from Twitter to TikTok. Millions watched, rewatched, and shared with captions like, "She just spoke for all of us." On cable news, the reactions were instant and visceral. A stunned commentator on one primetime panel muttered, "I've been covering hearings for 20 years, and I've never seen a moment like that. Never." Another host leaned into the camera, his tone almost reverent. What Jasmine Crockett did today wasn't just expose hypocrisy. She held up a mirror to the soul of this country. Americans across the spectrum began chiming in. Veterans called into radio shows to say she reminded them of the fight they thought they'd already won for truth and integrity. Immigrants posted in multiple languages. Finally, someone is standing where we cannot and saying what we've always known. From small towns to crowded cities, ordinary people claimed the moment as theirs. One viral post simply read, "She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for me, for my children, for every person told to sit down and shut up." Meanwhile, the antagonists scrambled. Their spin machines roared to life. Spokespeople rushed to podiums, carefully crafted talking points in hand, declaring the evidence misinterpreted, the recording taken out of context. The memorandum standard practice blown out of proportion, but the more they spoke, the more hollow it rang. Clips of their contradictions were replayed side by side, the arrogance of their earlier dismissals now mocking them in hindsight. Memes spread faster than their rebuttals. Screenshots of their panicked faces captioned, "With this, you." Their allies in the media tried to soften the blow, but even sympathetic anchors found themselves stumbling. The proof was too clear, too visceral. Every attempted excuse only deepened the sense of desperation. Viewers weren't buying it. The tide of public sentiment had shifted, and it was irreversible. Through it all, Crockett didn't flood the airwaves with self-congratulation. She didn't need to. Her silence in the aftermath only amplified the gravity of what had happened. The images of her in that courtroom, steady, unshaken, resolute, became iconic. Editorial boards described her as a new standard of integrity. In public life, civil rights leaders called her a torchbearer of truth. Even skeptics admitted they had underestimated her resolve. The impact wasn't confined to media headlines. In classrooms, professors replayed the footage for students as an example of how courage under pressure could redefine a narrative. Activist groups adopted her words in their chants at rallies. Truth doesn't stutter. Truth doesn't hide. Families around kitchen tables talked not just about the evidence, but about the feeling that for once someone inside the system hadn't flinched, hadn't bent, hadn't compromised. And the villains? They weren't just losing the argument, they were losing the narrative war. The smug confidence they once carried collapsed under the avalanche of public scorn. Their polished images cracked, their credibility drained with every viral replay. Of their stuttering denials, they had tried to corner Crockett, to paint her as naive, unprepared, overmatched. Instead, they were the ones exposed, flailing, panicked, and suddenly very small. But in the end, the resonance of that day wasn't just about humiliation or triumph. It was something deeper. The moment people kept replaying wasn't simply the exposure of lies, but the calm assurance in Crockett's voice. The way she refused to be rattled, the way she claimed space in a room designed to diminish her. It wasn't only about what she revealed. It was about what her defiance revealed in others. A hunger for honesty, thirst for accountability. A belief that truth could still cut through the fog. Americans everywhere said the same thing. She spoke for us. The antagonists would continue their spin, of course. They would marshal resources, release statements, and call in favors. But the damage was irreversible. The people had seen too much. The lesson had already embedded itself in the public consciousness. And yet the most powerful moment wasn't. The evidence itself was the lesson it carried. When the echoes of the hearing finally faded, what lingered was not just the sting of humiliation for the antagonists or the virality of Crockett's delivery. It was the clarity of a truth that could no longer be denied. She had done what few dared attempt in such a ruthless arena. She reframed the battle. Shifting it from a partisan skirmish into a universal reckoning, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. As a partisan warrior, though her opponents desperately wanted to cast her that way, she spoke as a witness for something larger. Something older than politics itself. The principle that truth when laid bare has no rival. Arrogance will always collapse under the weight of evidence, she said firmly, her gaze fixed not on her rivals, but on the American people watching beyond the walls. And lies, no matter how polished, cannot survive the light. It was a line that would be quoted endlessly, etched into the memory of that moment. For even as her detractors scrambled to spin, Judge Sullivan himself, the veteran jurist, known for his skepticism, leaned back in his chair and simply nodded. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even meant to be noticed. But in that quiet acknowledgement was a respect Crockett had earned through sheer composure and unrelenting truth. For a judge who rarely revealed his thoughts, the nod carried weight, signaled something undeniable. She had stood her ground, and she had won. The courtroom dynamic shifted in that instant. What had begun as a cross-examination of a young Congresswoman ended as a confirmation of her credibility, her grit, her authority. And for viewers at home, the message struck deeper than politics. It was about the nature of integrity itself. Commentators struggled to capture it. Some called it a turning point, others a reset moment for how truth could still pierce the noise of disinformation. But for millions of ordinary Americans, it was simpler. Crockett had shown that dignity could still silence the loudest lies. The beauty of it was not in the technicalities of the evidence, but in the reminder it carried that no matter how entrenched corruption seems, no matter how loudly arrogance postures, there remains a force stronger than both. Truth does not shout. It does not panic. It does not need theatrics. It simply waits, and when revealed, it leaves no escape. Crockett's calm precision became a symbol, not just for progressives or her supporters, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or told they weren't enough. She stood as proof that being underestimated can be a secret weapon. That resilience born in the shadows can rise and change the course of the fight in the light, and that was the ultimate lesson of the day. Evidence may take time to gather. Justice may take patience to pursue, but when the moment comes, truth is not merely powerful, it is unstoppable. As Americans reflected on the hearing, many described it not as a spectacle, but as a renewal. A reminder that even in a nation divided, there are still moments where principle triumphs over performance, where substance defeats spectacle. Crockett's victory wasn't measured in sound bites alone. It was measured in the collective sigh of relief that rippled across a weary nation, the belief that lies could still be confronted, and that courage still mattered. When she walked out of the chamber, there was no fist pump, no celebratory grin. Just the same steady stride she carried in a quiet confidence that the work of truth was never finished. But for millions who watched, her walk that day was more than an exit. It was a promise that the arc of justice, long as it may be, still bends when brave hands steady it. And for once, in that rarest of American moments, the truth didn't just win. It roared. Judge Sullivan asked for proof, and Jasmine Crockett delivered. Not with bluster, not with theatrics, but with evidence so undeniable, it froze the very halls of justice. In that moment, the story shifted. It wasn't just about a judge and an attorney. It was about the meaning of truth in America. And isn't that what we all long for? A reminder that no matter how loud the lies, no matter how polished the arrogance, dignity can stand taller. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended the idea that ordinary Americans deserve honesty, respect, and justice that doesn't bend to the powerful. That's why this moment matters. It belongs not just to one courtroom, but to every kitchen table where families wonder if fairness still exists, to every student who asks if integrity still wins, to every immigrant who came here believing America could be better than corruption and noise. But here's the truth. Crockett can't carry that fight alone. It takes people like you, people who refuse to let cynicism win, who demand evidence, who lift up leaders who speak with clarity. It's not cruelty. So if this story struck a chord, if it reminded you of the America worth fighting for, then don't Let it end here. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Be part of a community that amplifies truth, not silence. Because if Jasmine Crockett can stand tall in the face of power and deliver proof that even a judge could not ignore, then you can stand tall in your own life too. The movement is bigger than one case, one courtroom, one day. It's about all of us. And it starts with you, right now.